Have any of you ever felt like you were being tested? Constantly. I mean, I know that we all have had tests in school, and some of us endure testing every couple of months for doctors and so forth. But what I'm asking us here is, have any of us ever felt like the circumstances that we are going through in this life is a test of our fortitude, our strength, or our perseverance? And I'm guessing that those of you that said always probably feel like that most days, yes? Yes. Okay. Even if you're not sure, I'm sure that each of us can think of a time in our lives when we have been faced with a challenge that felt like our strength, our courage, and our peace were being taken away from us. I've often told folks that I no longer pray for patience, and there's a really good reason for this. Because when I ask for it, it's usually when my patience is needed the most, right? Or I'm given a circumstance or a situation in my life when my patience is tested even further. Sound about right? Yeah, okay. In God's infinite humor, it seems to me that when I pray for patience is when God tests my patience the most. I can tell us each that we're not alone. There are 3 very powerful women in this world, and I believe all 3 of them are deceased at this point. Yes, all 3 of them are deceased. Who can teach us a lot about what it means to be tested and yet persevere. There is the word of the great woman leader whose 58-year crusade may have launched more rotten eggs and tomatoes than ever been thrown in history, in the history of public speaking. The first breakthrough in her work for women's rights came after 20 years, when New York allowed married women to control their own property. Talk about testing your perseverance and your patience. Her ultimate goal was met when women were granted the right to vote. And it came 100 years after she was born and 14 years after she died. I am speaking of Susan B. Anthony. The second, we could take the word of the grandmother who took a sexually abused 8-year-old into her home in the Deep South during the Great Depression. The girl would not speak. Every morning for 5 years, her grandmother braided her hair at the traumatized girl's hair and would whisper encouragement into her ears. Finally, the day came when young Maya Angelou responded to her grandmother's persistence and found her voice. And oh, what a voice it became. She is considered one of the greatest poets of our modern age. And last but not least, this one you'll recognize before I ever finish reading this. There is the testimony of a great contemporary woman who became an icon of resistance when she refused to get up from her seat and move to the back of the bus. Her quiet defiance ignited the civil rights movement, challenging racial injustice with profound impact. I am, of course, speaking of Miss Rosa Parks. Known as the First Lady of Civil Rights, her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, a pivotal moment in the struggle for equality. Her steadfastness inspired generations of people to stand up against discrimination, and her legacy endures as a powerful symbol of courage, fight for freedom, reminding us of the impact that one person's life can have on society. As I thought about this story of Jacob this week at the Jabbok Ford or stream, I could not help but think about how the people who throughout history have given us examples to follow. These 3 women that I mentioned are just a few of the examples you can find if you try to do a search on the internet. But they are also 3 women that I have looked to as examples of the things that I may not be willing to do myself. It makes me wonder how much, because I'm unwilling to do them myself, how much we as a society fall short on the expectations of what God asks us to persist through in this life, to advance God's kingdom. I mean, if you think about it, right from the very beginning, God has only asked two things of us as the ultimate creation: to love God and love our neighbors. These women remind us that we do not love as we should. I also wonder how disappointed God might be with the amount of hatred and division there is in our world of today. A division that started long before us and is exemplified in the story of Jacob and Esau in our Bibles. Twin brothers who have been at this point divided for over 20 years. And what we have before us today is a story that comes smack dab in the middle of Jacob running away from one to another and from that back. He is now running away from Laban and towards Esau, his brother. And it just seems to me at this point in Jacob's story that he does an awful lot of running away from his problems and circumstances. At least until he spends the night wrestling with God at the Jabbok. And I have to admit that I have felt like Jacob quite a bit in my life. I'm not sure that I would have persisted as he did in this story, or even had enough strength to try and wrestle with God as much or as long as he did. But this particular story reminds us that it's okay to wrestle with God. In the chapter before this, when we're told that Jacob has deceived Laban yet again, to be able to leave, of course, after Laban deceived him. Now, let me just stop here for a second and say that this relationship is not one that I strive to have in my life. Seems to me that at any time we build a relationship based on deception or deceiving one another, we're only asking to sow division and hatred. Yes? Yeah. So despite this, though, Jacob has amassed some wealth and property while working for Laban for the last 20 years or so. In his final act of vengeance, Jacob takes the strongest of the flock that he has been given to tend, all of whom were as they agreed originally between him and Laban, and all of his harem, all of the women and servants that he's amassed, his 11 children, his 2 wives, and all of his household items, and leaves to go back to where his father had settled in the land of Canaan. Now, while on the way, it's a long journey. Remember, we talked about this. It's 500 and some odd miles, right? On that journey, Laban finally catches up to him because Jacob, in his infinite wisdom, leaves in the middle of the night once again. But Laban overtakes him and threatens to kill him for taking Laban's property. And without going into too much detail, let's just say that God intervenes once again on Jacob's behalf. They strike a deal to never interact with one another again. And I would say that's probably a good thing. Would you agree? If only people today could agree to disagree. Yet, Jacob is still facing a dangerous task, isn't he? And he's on his way to meet his brother who had it in for him 20 years ago. He must meet his brother who he deceived way back when, and Jacob still believes that Esau is out to kill him. Now again, before I get ahead of myself, let's just say that there's no interaction yet, but Jacob sends gifts to his brother to try and soften the blow, right? What do we do when we want to try and appease someone? Send them a gift, hoping to soften that edge. And that gets us to our story for this morning. Now, this is one of the shorter ones that we've read thus far, but it's deep and rich and full of meaning. So let me get us started by thinking about what it means to wrestle with God. Now, I'm sure there's some among us who feel like we should never wrestle with God. But I wonder if we think that, are we ever really truly being honest with ourselves? In Jacob's story, there's this man who approaches him in the middle of the night, We are told that after Jacob sends his entire household across the stream, that this man begins wrestling with him. And so that made me wonder what it really means to wrestle, right? I mean, what does it mean to wrestle to each of us? In this story, the Hebrew word that is translated as wrestle actually has a much better literal translation in get dusty, get dirty. Sound about right? When we wrestle with things, we typically are getting dirty or dusty. And so there's this physical image that popped into my mind of a high school wrestler on a mat, struggling to have the upper advantage. And so I wondered, do we do this with our faith? Do we try to understand? I mean, if we're truly being honest with each other here, I'm guessing that we have all struggled with our faith at some point or another. If you say that you have not, I have to ask the question whether you are being totally honest with yourself once again and with God. For our purposes this morning, I'm thinking this struggle with our faith looks like the questions we ask when someone we know or love, or maybe even ourselves, look up to heaven and say, really? This is where you want me right now? Or thinking about a recent tragedy in our local community. Really? It was time for a young man to lose his life and for a child to lose his father? Now, if you have not asked that question, we can chat later. But it's this idea that wrestling with God should not happen, or that questioning how or what we believe is not acceptable. And friends, it is. If we are struggling with our faith or what we believe, it just simply means that we are about to have a growth spurt, that we are about to be changed from the inside out. Our faith should not be stagnant. We should not be still in the moment. Our faith should never stop growing and changing and evolving. I mean, we're going through some tough scripture this summer because I want for us to realize that in struggling through the hard things in life, we are stretched and we grow. Going through challenges in life, despite how our human minds perceive them, helps us to become what God really intends for us to be. Think about this story in this way. Susan B. Anthony wrestled with the men in the world who thought that women did not have enough wisdom or knowledge to be able to vote and make wise decisions. Was that true? No. Okay. Whew. Now, we know that she was way right. I know more women who have more wisdom than the men in my life. Maya Angelou, a woman who I never thought was possible, got me interested in poetry, fought against the powers of this world through her pen to help influence a generation of activists. And the greatest example of perseverance in the modern age came at the expense of someone who simply refused to move to the back of the bus because she believed that we were all created equally in the eyes of God. Perseverance helps us to get through the tough times, but more importantly, perseverance helps us to stay strong when our spiritual foundation begins to shake. Jacob and many more like him wrestle with God and end up getting a blessing because they do. And I want to encourage us to continue to struggle with our faith, to continue to wrestle with God often. Because in the end, we end up stronger. We end up stronger, more faithful, and definitely more loving. Amen.